All right, everybody, continuing on with macros. Macros are the nutrients required in the largest amounts in our diet. We're going to start off with protein. So let's go back a little bit just to make sure you remember where we ended the last video was with vitamins and minerals. So starting with macros, protein, an important thing to remember, especially for your exam, if you're taking the NSCA CPT test, is protein is 4 calories per gram. So we're going to have to do some mathematical equations in the future to kind of convert calories to grams and help us give recommendations. So it's really important that remember protein is 4 calories per gram. Carbohydrates are actually going to be the same exact amount of calories per gram. The recommended dietary allotment is going to be how much protein do we need per day, basically, is going to be based off of your kilogram of body weight. Remember what we just saw from my plate in the last video from the USDA? It said like 1.2, I think was the range where it started from. Well, per NSCA guidelines, for general non-active people, it's going to be 0.83 grams of protein per kilogram. And then for athletes, it's going to be 1.4 to 2.0 per kilogram. So kind of makes sense why the USDA put 1.2 because it's right before that athlete mark. And then strength training or muscle gains, we would suggest at least 1.6 grams per kilogram. And then the upper limit, so something we wouldn't want to go over, is 2.2 per kilogram. Or just, we wouldn't want to suggest that. However, everyone's different. Primary role of protein is, remember, it's not for energy. Instead, it's primary structural and functional component of every cell in our human body. Its main purposes are to repair, build tissue. It can also be oxidized for energy when other energy sources are low, but that would be like in a dire situation, for example. Animal-based proteins contain all of the essential amino acids. Soy is the only plant-based proteins that contains all 8 essential amino acids. So if your client's using pea protein, just remind them that there's there's essential amino acids, and for the best quality protein, we would want to make sure that we get all of the essential amino acids in our protein if possible. Other protein considerations is an energy deficit. So when overall caloric intake or stored energy is low, the body's protein requirement goes up as it may use protein for energy. So it's when our is using protein for energy, we are in a state of, we could be near starving. It's usually a situation that is very unhealthy. So just something to be aware of if we're having very limited calories. Protein sources, so animal-based proteins and soy, kind of just a reminder, contain all 8 amino acids that our body cannot produce on its own. Most other plant proteins do not contain all 8. Excess protein, so consuming more protein than needed for tissue synthesis, means the excess is converted into other substrates and used for energy, could potentially be in a lot of excess stored as fat. Remember, high protein, however, is not bad. We just want to stay within those ranges. And often it's hard to even hit those ranges. So wouldn't worry too much about overdoing it unless you're really hitting those marks. You're going over 2.2 grams per kilogram body weight every single day. Health and safety, while there are no concerns about negative effects from high protein, as we kind of just mentioned in healthy individuals, excessively high intakes over 4 grams per kilogram are contraindicated for people who have impaired kidney function, aka renal function, low calcium intake, or those restricting fluid intake. All right, moving on to carbohydrates. Just a reminder, carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram. So when we're doing our mathematical equations, the only one that's different is fat. It's going to be 9 calories per gram. The recommended daily allotment, or how much carbs do I need per day? Well, at the minimum, you need 50 to 100 grams per day to prevent ketosis, aka high levels of ketones in the bloodstream. But for the recommendation for general population, for anaerobic and skill athletes, 5 to 6 grams per kilogram. If for aerobic endurance athletes, so those who work out 90 minutes or more each day, it's 7 to 10 grams per kilogram. So once you get like the estimated caloric number per day for your client or yourself, then all you need is the person's body weight to give the protein recommendation and also to give the carbohydrate recommendation. So far, we've learned how to estimate caloric needs, give a protein rec, and give a carb rec. So now we only need to dial down the fat and a couple other things. Primary role, main source of energy for athletic performance. So carbs give us our energy. When we start working out, our body is looking for sugar in our bloodstream, right? We get that glucose and aka sugar from ingesting carbs. So sometimes when you first meet with a client, or say someone first takes an exercise class for the first time in the semester, or they start a new training program for the first time and they're not fueling in an extra, they're not thinking fueling extra to support that, they might get a little lightheaded because on the onset of exercise, our muscles are pulling sugar from our bloodstream. If we haven't eaten in a while, or we're not eating the right amounts, or we're not fueling our body, there's not anything for our muscles to feed off of, and we could get a little bit lightheaded, not have enough energy. So we will talk about that a little bit later, hypoglycemia. However, it's just important to emphasize the portions of carbs are essential if we're working out, not only for staying alive, but remember, if we add that physical activity, this macronutrient is super important, just as important as fat and protein. Carbohydrate restriction is not necessary for fat loss. So we'll get into a little bit of like fad diets, how we can manipulate these ranges so that we can do have weight loss as a goal. And yeah, let's keep moving on. So we'll talk a little bit about fats. While we don't need a lot of fats to stay alive, consuming less than 15% can negatively impact things such as testosterone production, absorption of essential vitamins. So we definitely want to have a good amount. Fat is going to be the highest calorie per gram. It's going to be 9 calories per gram. So that's why the portion that we ingest is a little bit less. There's more calories per gram. The recommended daily intake of fat ranges from 30% or less total daily calories. So, going back to when you're estimating your daily calories, times that number that you get times 0.30, our fat calories should come from that or less. With the categories of fat, there's also further suggestions. So, unsaturated fats, you see in this picture, that's the one on the right side. They're derived from vegetables and plants. They're comprised of monosaturated fats like in avocados, olives, and nuts, and polyunsaturated fats like in sesame oil. Another type of unsaturated fat is omega-3 fatty acids. So we want to aim for these unsaturated fats to be at least 20% of the total calories. So if we can get a big chunk of our fats to be unsaturated, that's gonna be good. Then saturated fats. So that's in the picture all the way to the left. They're derived largely from animal products like meat, dairy, eggs, but also plant-based sources. There's divided opinions on whether they're harmful or beneficial, but per our recommendation, we just want to stay within our limits. So we want to limit to less than 10% of total calories. Remember, everything in moderation. And then the one that we want to limit the most, meaning we want to ingest the least, is trans fats. So trans fats in this picture on our slide is that middle picture. They're used to extend the shelf life of processed foods. And we want to limit that to less than 1% of our total calories. We also want to check for partially hydrogenated oils, maybe limit those from our diet as much as we can. And then omega-6 fatty acids, we want to consume about 3% of this for our daily energy. Omega-3 fatty acids consume about 0.5 to 1% of daily energy. And omega-3 fatty acids falls under that category of unsaturated fats. We'll see right here actually in this next slide. A couple examples of each type. Remember, the ones that we want to limit the most is trans. then limit the second most to saturated, and the biggest portion of our fats won't come from unsaturated. This middle column shows some examples, and then all the way to the right is intake recommendations, health impacts. I just like this picture because it shows the structure of the bond, shows examples, and has some pretty information. All right, continue with macros, how to convert grams to calories. So, quick reminder, what was protein? How many calories was protein per gram? If you said four, great job, because exactly. So, how do we convert grams to calories? To find the total calories in a food item, multiply the grams of each macronutrient by its corresponding calorie value, then add them all together. So, let's say a food item contains 25 grams of carbs, 20 grams of protein, 10 grams of fat. Well, all I have to do is 25 grams of carb times 4 calories per gram. That's going to be 100 calories. Protein, 20 grams times how much calories is it per gram? 4, 80 calories. And then fat has that highest amount of calories per gram, right? So if it's 10 grams of fat, 10 times 9 is going to be 90 calories, making the total 270 calories. In the test, so if you're taking the NSCA CPT test, they will ask you to convert each way. So to reverse that, if you had 100 calories of carbs, how do we know how much grams of carbs? Well, we would divide by 4. So to get the calories, we want to times, and then to get the grams, we're going to divide. So just know you might have to be good at reading the question very carefully and slowly to see what is the value that they want at the end. Remember, protein 4, carbohydrate 4, fat is 9. All right, moving on. This is a nutrition label. So this is an extra that we added to the slide just so that we can educate our clients further. If you have, say that you're doing your nutrition session with your client where you're going over macros, and if you have a snack nearby, it's a great, or even if you just have this slide, it's a great example to show your client about serving size. So we want to emphasize that, we have packaged foods. Sometimes inside the packaged food, there's multiple serving sizes. So we just want them to be aware of how to measure a serving size. There's also such things as food scales. So as you see, the serving size says 1 cup or 228 grams. Well, a food scale would help you get to that 228 gram measurement. And then we can check the calories per serving. We want to limit the nutrients at the top for this nutrition label. It's going to be fat. Remember, saturated fat and trans fat, we want to limit those. And then we want to get enough of these nutrients at the bottom. But hopefully, we're eating vegetables and fruits so that we're getting enough of those nutrients at the bottom too, and not looking for them in like fortified in foods. And then I think that's the biggest takeaway about the nutrition label is teaching them serving size and maybe suggesting a food scale if some of the serving sizes have to do with weight. Let's do a sample question. So, how many fat calories per day should be consumed on a 2,500 calorie per day diet if I want my client to consume that 20 to 30% calories from fat? And then the second question, even though it says number one again, is how many grams of fat should be consumed on this 2,500 calorie a day diet? So, how many calories per gram was fat again? It was 9. So, let's keep that in mind. When we want to get a percentage of a number, we could times this 2,500 by 0.2, and then separate calculation 2,500 by 0.3. That's going to give us that range of where we're at. So let's go ahead and do that. First question, 2,500 by 0.2. So that's what we would do to get 500. 2,500 by 0.3 is going to give us 700. And then we have 500 for the second question. So we got our range of 500 to 750 calories, but then they wanted to know how many grams of fat should be consumed. So I can give my client, hey, stay within 500 to 70 calories of fat per day, but it's also nice to give them grams. Sometimes grams is what we get on the back of our nutrition label, right? So we would have to divide. Remember when we're getting to grams, we want to divide, and we're going to divide by 9 because that's the calories per gram. So 500 divided by 9 is 55.6, and then 750 divided by 9 is 83.3. That'll give us the grams of fat they could stay within. Awesome. So we're moving on to hydration. And this is a little bit different than our last lecture. So we added a couple more slides for hydration. So get excited, y'all. The goal of fluid intake, the goal of fluid intake, the primary goal is to prevent dehydration. So the primary goal is to keep us hydrated and maintain proper fluid balance. Relying on thirst alone as a signal of when I should drink some water is not a good sign, or for our clients, it's not a good sign for them, as it's only triggered after an individual is already a bit dehydrated. So this is not ideal during training. We want to have some type of hydration schedule or intention so that we're not just basing our fluid intake off of thirst. Our daily fluid needs change based on many factors, including the environment that we live in, how much people sweat, and body size and composition. So for sedentary adults, so this is general, remember, keyword is general. A general guideline is to consume 1.5 to 2.7 quarts or 1.4 to 2.6 liters per day. Oops. The main goal of hydration is fluid balance and prevent dehydration. Fluid intake and exercise. So here's some good recommendations you can give to your client or just adopt for yourself. And then if you have a water bottle next to you, see how many milliliters it is. It makes it pretty easy to put this into perspective. Usually a water bottle is around, let me see if I can look it up quickly. I don't have one next to me right now, but it's around the suggested milliliters. So before exercise, we want to approximately have 5 to 7 milliliters of fluid per kilogram of body weight at least 4 hours before exercise. But if the client is already dehydrated or their urine is dark and scant, they're letting you know this, then we also want to do 3.5 milliliters per kilogram 2 hours before. So we want to hydrate closer to the time that we're going to start sweating. During exercise, have the client drink to their comfort. And then after, for every pound lost, 20 to 24 ounces or 600 to 70 milliliters for every pound lost. Again, that's like around a water bottle. So even if you're not weighing your client before and after, if you notice they're sweating a lot, please encourage them to drink a water bottle or two after they work out. Sodium-rich foods or sports drinks can also be used to stimulate thirst, replace lost electrolytes, and enhance rehydration, but we'll get into that a little bit more. And then I just looked it up. Most water bottles is 500 milliliters to 750 milliliters. So as a generic suggestion, I think it's super important to just say, hey, stay hydrated, water bottle after or two, and then maybe one before, depending on how hydrated they are, is whether they're going to do 4 hours before or 2 hours before. All right, moving on. During the rehydration process, urine is produced before rehydration occurs, so it's always happening. All foods and fluids contribute to hydration. Indicators, well, going back to that first bullet, sometimes our urine will tell us that we're dehydrated even if we're in the process of rehydrating. Indicators of dehydration is dark yellow, strong smelling urine, weight change, dry skin, decreased urine output, rapid resting heart rate, and then prolonged soreness. So it's really important for us to educate our clients about the importance of hydration and fluid replacement. So fluid requirements for exercise is that we just want to make sure that we have a schedule. We're adjusting fluid choice based off the duration of the session, and we're having a strategy. So before and after activity, we want to make sure that we're meeting the requirements. So for fluid sources, acceptable fluid sources are water, they say chocolate milk after, juice, carbonated or non-carbonated soft drinks, and sport drinks. These are just examples of fluid sources. Obviously, water would be one of the best choices for all activity. Dietary contribution. So people who consume lots of fruits, vegetables, and soups meet a significant portion of their daily fluid requirements just through that food. And when we talk about caffeine, caffeine containing beverages contribute to hydration. Regular consumption of caffeine will eventually you'll develop a tolerance to it within 1 to 4 days, which can lead to decreased urine output. Finally, last slide about fluid replacement is fluid intake during activity. During activity, the best choice of fluid is where to go. The best choice of fluid is one that is both rapidly absorbed and palatable, or just the client's choice. For short duration under 60 minutes, water is perfect. Long duration over 60 minutes, we want our fluids to start replacing the electrolytes and carbohydrates. Carbohydrates being key. If the activity is long duration, the fluid should contain sodium to prevent the development of hyponatremia, so dangerous low sodium levels. Some good ideas or examples of what we can get for workouts longer than 60 minutes are sports drinks. So there's some pretty effective options for long duration activity as long as they contain the electrolytes, but we want to make sure that they have that carbohydrate concentration between 6 to 8%. And honestly, this picture on the left, I'm not sure if any of these, besides the Gatorade, has that carbohydrate concentration. So just make sure you're getting some carbohydrates in that drink, especially if it's like zero sugar, low sugar, there might not be any carbs. And that's what we need for that energy, right? Weight gain nutrition. So what we'll do is we will stop right here with this video and we'll have a third video where we talk about weight gain, weight loss, and a couple other categories. All right, thank you, everybody.